Hey everybody, I am going to do a video explaining how I do isometric in Foundry VTT. So this is a big topic, and it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. I play in a not top-down view when I play D&D. I play isometric when I'm using a virtual tabletop. And I've been doing this for years in Roll20, but in switching to Foundry VTT, had to figure out, okay, what are the tips and tricks? What are the things I'm going to have to figure out as I'm preparing my game so that I start building up a consistent set of assets and maps and tokens and things that represent isometric play in D&D. So this took me a little while, and I had to go digging around in communities. There's no obvious answer here. There's no perfect answer either, but I wanted to make a video explaining what I've arrived at and how I'm going to attempt to do this for my first game in Foundry, which I will be playing in isometric. So here's what I'm going to cover. I'm going to cover why I'm doing this, why I'm not playing in Gridless, kind of the inspiration for all of this, and some of the community that contributed the things that I figured out to put together to kind of mash up into this idea of how I'm going to play. So for those that don't want to watch the whole video, this is basically how I do it. I'm going to create an isometric overlay pattern that's 150 pixels wide by 87 pixels tall. That's this right here. And I'm going to use that as a pattern overlay when I make maps. That's a concept from Photoshop. Maybe it maps to other tools. But you can imagine tiling these and then kind of getting this pattern here, which is an isometric map that I'm going to have in my photo editing tool, which I'm going to use to size both kind of art assets for the map and the tokens, just to think through how all that's going to fit. I'm going to make backgrounds, and I'm going to import them into Foundry VTT on a grid that is a 100 pixel sized hex grid using the hexagonal columns odd setting. And that's going to allow me to align a hexagonal grid over that's going to match perfectly, or close to perfect. I'm going to use the Hex-Size-Support module to adjust the tokens that I use so that they align perfectly on that grid, and add some sort of, some basic usability for the players, that when they move the tokens around, they just snap to that grid perfectly, and allows me to do some tactical play. I'm also going to solve the problem of spell templates quickly, and figure out how am I going to run spell templates, and how I'm going to make it so that the players can take their area of effect spells, put them on the grid, and understand exactly which monsters they're hitting, just as if we were playing this in a different tool, or just as that fully supported isometric, or just as if we were playing on the table and we've got our little paper cutouts for the area of effect spells when we drop them down. So this is sort of an in progress, right? Some of the modules I'm using here are still under development. Isometric support might be added fully to Foundry someday, so this is just kind of a point in time. I want to talk through the limitations here. What's not perfect? What am I going to have to get the players to understand that, oh, this isn't perfect, but you're going to have to do the rest of this manually, or count boxes manually, that sort of thing. And I'm going to share out what I'm doing in a Dropbox, so check the links below for kind of links to all of my inspirations and the modules, but also I'm going to try and make a Dropbox links that has some of these templates that I use so that you can try it yourself. All right, so let's get into it. So why am I doing this? Well, first of all, Gridless isn't good enough. So what I've got here is sort of an isometric setup using some art assets. This was my first attempt, and this is not what I'm going to do, but this was my first attempt. So I'm playing in a gridless setup. So when I go in and look at this, it's set to gridless, but you'll see that all this stuff still exists in Foundry for gridless. There's a grid size 100, and it represents 5 feet, and that sort of governs how many pixels the measure tools in Foundry, how many pixels these represent. So I can kind of measure stuff here, and it still decides how many pixels it is, but that's on a square grid, not an isometric grid. The way that isometric works is that dimensions like diagonal on that dimension and diagonal on this dimension, as well as the vertical dimension, represent the same distance for the same space, but it's warped. Pure side to side is not included in that. That is warped, and you'd have to compute that differently if this was fully supported. Also, messing with these tokens, you can see there's a box around the token. That token, right, is the way that creating new tokens and things still works on a square grid. even though I said gridless. It's not bringing in the tokens at necessarily the correct sizes. It's still treating them as if they're going to be these top-down circular tokens that fit within a 100 by 100 pixel space. So, I could take a new token. I could take token art here and drag it in and bring it in as a new NPC, and it still tries to map it to a 100. Let me take something else. Let me go find a token I've got. Let me take another token and drop it in as an NPC. It's still trying to squeeze it into this 100 space. So this smaller gnome character, I actually had to go in and manually set a size to drop it to smaller. But when it was in its original size, it was wrong, right? And I had to go and adjust this. It originally was like that, and I had to go change it to a different image size. I think I dropped it to something like this, right? And that's all kind of awkward. Equally, when this character gets close to monsters, right? The monsters and their, what do I go by? Do I go by this box or do I go by the base size? Some of these monsters, right, have a base over here, but they've got art that sticks way over the edge. So is the gnome allowed to walk right up to here, or does the gnome have to stop, where the kind of image stops here, where that bar is? It gets pretty unclear, and it's like playing gridless on a map, except the measure tool isn't necessarily correct. So things get weird really quickly, and a good example of that is when I take an actual, this is a cleric, he's a light domain cleric, so he does have the fireball spell. So I'm going to go and actually cast the fireball, and I'm going to say, yeah, let's do the whole thing. Let's cast the spell, let's place a measured template, let's cast it, and it says, go find a 20-foot circle. This is not an isometric 20-foot circle. This is a top-down circle. So I can drop it here and go, this is great, I can hit all these people, right? It's like, well, I don't know. It's not perfect. We're kind of mixing and matching different concepts. What you do and don't hit there is kind of unclear to me. So this is not perfect. There's a lot of weird parts to it, including, that image is very large, so clicking on it, I start getting stacking problems. Like I can't click the gnome now. If the tokens start stacking up, I can't click the gnome because this thing's in front of it. So I have to move it to grab the gnome to click the thing. This is all, I started messing with this and trying lots of different permutations of seeing if I could get this to work. Resizing the tokens, having to click, some of the things I really like about Foundry just kind of aren't supported. And it got really ugly really quickly for me, and was more work than I really wanted to get into, kind of hacking isometric play into gridless. I actually found that easier in Roll20 than I found in Foundry. So I wanted to really invest some time and see if I could get this to work, and I was successful. So I had to learn how to do this in Roll20 a long time ago. What process did I use then? Well, I went to Google, the same as everybody else, and I found this really cool artist, Plex Soup, who had sort of the famous isometric YouTube video back in the day for figuring this out. So, I went in and I watched the video, same as everybody else. He was selling art packs on the Roll20 marketplace, and he had really good tips. It required API scripts, but you could build these modular, as long as sort of they had long hallways between the rooms for the art style. You could light them. He had really good tips. This person had really good tips for how to draw the line of sight, dynamic lighting walls as X's rather than trying to trace the outlines of things. It was a really good video. I used this to learn how to play in Roll20, and I started exploring other artists. So the artist that I found that I really loved was Epic Isometric. I bought the core set, but then I found out that this person had a pretty great Patreon, releases new art in this isometric style. So I'm all set for art. I got all the art I need for my game. I love hacking new art. I'm going to share some of that in the Dropbox. There's a big community in the Discord that kind of shares their tips and tricks and maybe some of their modifications of the art. I post some of my stuff there. So I really like using this stuff, and I use that to build, my whole game, which I've put up some on YouTube here. So this is my YouTube channel where I'm kind of going through and doing fast forward replays. But this type of tactical combat, I'm playing gridless in Roll20, and it gets messy, right? It's fun, but it gets messy. And I want to take this fun into Foundry because this is how I prefer to play. So, there's a support request or a feature request that's pretty long standing here. This is a 5-year-old idea. Hey, bring the isometric grid to Roll20. And in 5 years, we really haven't gotten much in the way of an update. Or, there's just not enough people, I guess. I went and pushed and said, hey, I tried to revivify this thread, and I got it up to 49, which is respectable, but there really hasn't been a response from Roll20 that's serious in here. And people have explained it. Yeah, perspective versus isometric versus axonometric, right? There's different things that we see in video games that can relate to. Oftentimes, people take anything that's 3D and say, oh, that's isometric, and that's not quite true. Isometric means that this dimension, that dimension, and the vertical dimension are all equidistant, right? So from this center point here, that diagonal, and that straight up and down are the same distance, right, in the 2D space. And so you get some very interesting maps, and you get examples of like fond memories that we have. But that's not how Foundry works. Foundry is top down. So this is the Foundry sort of alpha release thing. You can see a lot of the tools that they're building and kind of the expectations of how it's all going to work. You go in the Discord for, Foundry, and this is one of the only things they can't help you with is how to work in isometric, other than I hear some people are playing in Gridless. Why don't you check out what they're doing? I'm like, yeah, that's me. I'm playing in Gridless. So it's a little frustrating, and I want to make something to help out because there is a community of people who want to do this. So you look at the Foundry, kind of like the overview of features, which is kind of a little bit of their roadmap here. And they actually list out isometric. They actually talk about it, which I appreciate. And they say, yeah, we're not working on it yet. It's not currently in a planning stage yet for something that they're going to do. They have so many other things that they want to do, to launch the platform, which they've done now, and to move it forward. So maybe they'll get to this eventually. They're making quick progress. But it's going to be a while, so I did want to find a solution because I'm used to playing all my role-playing video games in isometric or something close to it. So this is Final Fantasy Tactics, which a lot of people use as sort of the big game that made people want to play. And in this game, you can rotate around, right? Sort of you can hit the trigger buttons on the PS1 controller, I believe, and you can kind of pivot the dimensions to see things from different angles. You can't do that in any virtual tabletop. I mean, that would be crazy cool. You can do it in you can do it in Tailspar, which is full 3D. That's a very different style of game prep. I'm not quite ready for that yet. I'm really hoping that gets more mature, but it's kind of a full 3D video game. It's not a web-based virtual tabletop. One of the huge advantages of this is you get height. All right, so here's an example of the main character of the game, is able to go and walk and get a height advantage, and there's a gate here, right? So you can go fight, and you have to think about who's on top of the gate, who's under the gate. There's characters that can be at different verticalities on top of each other. It adds a real tactical aspect to the game. So you can get that in tabletop. You can get that in actual physical minis D&D, but you can't get that in any of the top-down tabletops. It's just super awkward. So I want to get to that point. This is Baldur's Gate 2, which, looking at it again, actually doesn't look that isometric. It looks axonometric, right? A slightly different projection. But this still has some of the advantages of being able to see the monsters from the side, and I love it. So I want to do that. So one thing that I found when I was doing Roll20, I decided not to do this in Roll20, is there was an old post by this artist, Luvian Blue, talking about the ability to align a hex map to an isometric map, that they actually overlaid really nicely, and you could trick Roll20 into doing some very isometric-like things on a hex grid. And I've wanted to run this forever, but there were some problems with Roll20 that made this really difficult to do, and I'll get into those. So this is actually just a link to an Imgur, or Imgur, I don't know what you call that. So this is the Luvian Blue approach, where in Roll20, you can see that this token is snapping to the map, right? And it's moving correctly, and everything seems to work, but there is a problem, and you can see it when it rotates. And let me pause that. So the problem is that this is a tall token art. That token art is centered and has to be centered because it's going to snap to the center of the isometric grid, which is actually a hex grid. So it has to be, perfectly dimensioned vertically so that it snaps, and then the base still lands perfectly inside one of these tokens. So you can see it here. This token is actually centered right here not right here. So this token is perfectly, balanced top to bottom so that the bottom still seems like it lands and snaps to the grid that it's standing on, but it's not. It's actually measured and doing all the snapping from the center of mass of the body, the center of the image here. And that makes play actually kind of complicated. It means that if you've got a whole asset library of art and they've got too much headroom on the token, it's not going to align correctly. If it's not, the perfect number, you would have to go and resize in Photoshop all of your art, and nobody wants to do that. So I started looking at that. I got it working like this in Roll20. This person was great. They put their Roll20 settings in here. But Luvian Blue, great approach with this hex grid that aligns perfectly to this isometric grid. I didn't know you could do that. But the problem is you have to basically hack all of your art. So every single token you want to bring in, you're going to have to prepare in Photoshop first, and I don't have that kind of time. So when taking to isometric, I looked at this, I thought, is this going to be possible in Foundry? Only if I can control the anchor point of the token. Only if the token art can hang beyond the edge, right? So beyond the edge of the box that it thinks it exists in. So let's take this example here, right? Of this gnome, I can scale it, beyond one, but I need to actually offset it as well. I would need to find a module that can do that. Good news is there's a community and there's other people trying to get other kinds of games to work. So there is a module, and it was not built for isometric, and it was not even built for D&D. It was built for a different game and a different community. And it's the community that plays heavily on hex grids. That is the mech warrior, mech combat community, which has a long history of playing tabletop games on a hex grid. So the community specifically was the ones playing Lancer. Never played it. Looks super cool. Itch.io to go and check that out. It looks like an indie game. And here's a screenshot from somebody from one of the communities that I'm in that has figured out using offsets and things. You can see it right here. That's what I'm going for. I'm going for the token that fits on a hex grid perfectly, has the area that they are implied in the game space to be occupying, but has the art stretching above, maybe even on a multiple, dimension-sized hex, right? Because you can play D&D on hexes. I want to still play on the ISO squares, but here, they've kind of got it figured out. So I investigated this token that my friend pointed me at, which is called Hex-Size-Support. So with this, you can go and mess with the snapping of hexes, but most importantly, and there's a little note, I don't think they even have it described as a most important feature of this, but it has an added ability which you can bring in things, even ones that have a lot of transparent space on the side, and get them to adjust with the arrow keys and stuff right there. That thing that it's doing right now, that is what I'm looking for. So that was the final missing piece to be able to implement this. All right, so let's go through it. I'm going to bring out Photoshop and let's go through it. So first, I'm trying to achieve what this artist is doing right here, where this hex is overlaid perfectly on that isometric grid. So now we have to start getting into some math. We have to start getting into the dimensions that you're looking for. You can see that the isometric right here, right, is actually wider than the hex, right? It looks like it goes to the center of this hex and to the center of that line, but it's actually, if it's centered, it's going to be anchored right there. So it does match the height, but it doesn't match the width. So now we have to pull out, what are the dimensions of a hexagon? Well, there's a great sizer, the Hexagon calculator. So if I'm going to line this up, maybe say to a grid that is 100 on the vertex to vertex dimension, which is how one of the hexes actually works in Foundry, on 100 scaled thing, which will make the math really easy because it's divisible by 10. So if I had a 72 DPI grid, that I would get the dimensions here, but I actually have a 100 dimension grid. So I can see vertex to vertex, that's 100 pixels, but the height is 86.60, and that's the number that I need. I'm going to have to round that to a square pixel, so I'm going to have to round that to 87 to get something to tile in Photoshop nicely, which means over time, it's going to start drifting off the grid, which isn't great, but we'll live with that because it's only 4/10 of a pixel off of being perfect. So as long as I'm able to survive that, I'm gonna have everything laid out really nicely, especially side to side, but it is gonna have some drift vertically, so that's a downside. But then I have to figure out that isometric stretches farther out over the left to right sides of the hex. So how much is that? So it's half of this dimension right here, right? So it's actually half of this. So it's going to be 25 on each side. So it's 100 plus half of this plus half of this again. So it's going to be 100 plus 25 plus 25, 150 by 87 is what we're targeting. All right, so let's go to Photoshop. What I'm going for is a 100 DPI image that is 150 wide by 87 tall. I'm going to hit create new. I'm going to zoom that in, and I'm actually going to go and mess with my grid, my preferences, so that we're getting really specific on pixels here. So I'm going to bring up the grid preferences. I'm going to say, all right, let's see, it has a grid line every 1 inches, which is 100 pixels because it's 100 DPI. Okay, and subdivisions, I don't want 4, I want 10. All right, so every 10 pixels, there's going to be a grid. All right, so this is 150, so this should be 15 boxes wide, or 8 and a little bit tall. All right, so now I'm going to take the line tool, and I'm going to start messing with this. I'm going to make a new transparent layer. I'm going to take the line tool. I'm going to make the stroke black on this, and then I'm going to align, and I'm going to draw this cross. I'm going to draw another cross, and then I'm going to hide the background. And now I can take this entire image, and I can, in the edit menu, there's a setting called define pattern. So when I define the pattern, it makes this box, and I can say, call it the isometric grid overlay pattern. And I hit OK here. So I create a brand new layer, and in this layer, I'm going to fill it with, just a color or something. It doesn't matter what color. I'm going to fill it with green. And then in this layer's blending options, so I'm going to bring up the blending options in Photoshop, there's a pattern overlay. So I'm going to create a pattern overlay. This is one of the ones that comes with Photoshop. And there it is right there, hex ISO. And now it tiled that thing, and it's perfect, right? It's 87 tall by 150 wide, which is what I want. And now, I don't like that green, but this is just a pattern overlay. So it's just burning those black lines onto this layer. So don't mess with the opacity, because that'll make the grid less light. Instead of the opacity, mess with the fill. So if I drop the fill, then it's stopping the green from kind of, I don't know, whatever it does, filling in. It doesn't affect the blending options on it. So that's still there. Awesome. So now this is the image that I'm going to go and I'm going to take over to Foundry VTT. So let's try that. So I would save this as a big JPEG. Let's go to a brand new scene. So there's a totally new scene, and you can see its settings are the same as like the defaults for Foundry. So I'm going to go and pull open my Perfect Hexback 87 by 100. I select it, and I call this Making ISO, and I'll save the changes. So there it is. Great. But now I need to align the hex grid perfectly. So I'm going to configure it again. I'm going to go to the grid type, do hexagonal columns odd. Grid size 100 represents 5 feet of D&D space. Perfect. So I'm going to do that, and you can see that this actually lines up perfectly. But if it didn't because you had something that was at different dimensions or whatever, and it didn't start lining up perfectly, then all you would have to do is you'd have to configure it, and you go to the sizing thing. You zoom in as much as you want, and I could use the arrow keys or just kind of edit these things here, and I could get what I'm looking for is I want the bottom of the hex grid to intersect with the bottom, with down here, and I want this centered, which means once I start doing that, then over here in this grid, it's going to represent that, and so that's perfect. And in fact, let's just take it back to 0. Yeah, that's still good. That's close enough. So you're going to see that this overlays perfectly left to right. So the leftmost tile is good. You zoom over, the rightmost tile is still perfect. but it doesn't work perfectly top to bottom. This hexagonal stuff that Foundry is drawing is going to be 86.6 whatever, right? You know, that perfect, you know, dimension that was listed, 86.6025. But I can't make a pixel of that size. I can only make a pixel that's, you know, 86 or 87. So back in Foundry, here it works out really nicely up here, but if I go to the bottom of the image, you're going to see some drift. And it's just a little bit of drift. But if you have a really tall battle map, you're going to start seeing some drift, and players are going to notice that their tokens aren't matching perfectly. That's okay, you know, as long as it stays within, you know, maybe, you know, 5 or 10 pixels. But once it starts getting more, it's going to start becoming a bigger problem. If you hate this, if you absolutely hate this, you can always increase the number of pixels, like the DPI and the scaling, so that less error gets introduced over the number of tiles. But it's never going to be perfect with the way that this is working right now. But it's pretty darn good. So I'm going to go and I'm going to take a token, and I'm going to align that token, a medium token, to this grid perfectly. So I'm going to take a token that I've got that just is not really built at all for top down, or for, you know, it's something that has, you know, like a sword sticking over the side. So I'm going to take this guy here from the Epic Isometric. I'm going to make an NPC for them. And you can see that it's trying to fit inside that hex. But I have installed this pretty excellent Hex-Size-Support, and I'll give the link to it. You can't install this as a normal module. It's still under the development, so it hasn't been submitted to the Foundry, you know, module repo or whatever that is. Instead, you have to install it using the, there's like a JSON link here. You have to install it using the JSON manifest URL in here, inside this thing. So you can install that in Foundry instead. But it's still under development. For all I know, they'll make an update and everything will break. But until they do that, this seems to be working reasonably well. So in Foundry, I'm going to go double click on this token, and go token, and then into the image, and then there's a new, no, into the position. So there's a new section in the position that wasn't here until I installed that module, which is the Hex Token Size Support. And it has snapping settings that you can mess with. That's more for actually playing on a hex. That's more for that Lancer video game, or role-playing game. But for token display options, here, that's what I'm looking for. I have a couple of things. Now I can hit the Alt key or the Option key on a Mac, and I can hold that and hit the up and down arrows. And now I can resize this token, right? And now I can use the normal arrow keys. All right, so now I can align this perfectly. So this big hulking barbarian person is going to align to this grid, right? And I'm aligning them to the isometric, the big thick lines, not the hex grid. I'm going to save the changes, close, close. Now this token will actually snap to the grid, right? It snaps to this combat grid that's here. And I can actually use the distance measuring thing, right, to actually have them do some tactical movement on the map. And it works perfectly. The only thing it doesn't do perfectly is when I want to move the character sort of, you know, left to right here. You can see that it's doing this zigzag diagonal pattern, you know, this zigzagging thing that is what you do in hex games. You have to move on the dimension that's not supported. Right, the isometric, you can move in 8 possible dimensions, but on a hex you can only move in 6 possible directions. So the 2 directions that are not handled well in this hex are that what is, you know, to us looking at it in 2D, pure left to right is not handled well. So moving from this isometric square to here should be 5 feet, but according to Foundry right now it's 10 feet. So anytime a character is moving left to right like that, you need to make sure that you're just kind of moving the mini manually and going 5, 10, 15. It's the diagonal problem in D&D. It's just now rotated on its side. But everything else is going to work great. So I got that, and I can build up a library of pre-sized minis. And the way that you do that, maybe you import your stuff using VTTA, is I would take a mini that I imported with VTTA. So let's take like a humanoid. Let's take a kobold, right? So that's the art from VTTA, you know, imported from D&D Beyond. Great. But now I can go and I can drag and I can find like a kobold in my art library that I've got, loaded in from, maybe one of these artists that I've backed. So I'm going to go find an art and I'm dropping it in as an NPC. And that's going to create a thing that I'm going to have to clean up later here. So maybe I would just browse to where that art is. But now this token, I can take the token and I can position it. And this is a small creature. It's supposed to be smaller. So I can size it down smaller and center it in this grid. All right, save changes, close. And now I can take, not this is the instance, this is the token. I want the prototype. So now I can take the kobold here and let's make a copy of it just so I don't mess with the library that I've got of top-down art. So I can duplicate it and I can say kobold, just for purposes here, ISO. And I can mess not with the token, but with the prototype token. And all I have to do is click the one that's on the screen and then hit assign token. And it takes all the settings from this guy and shoves it into the prototype, close. I can delete both of these. Now I can take this kobold and look at that. 7 foot tall barbarian, 4 foot tall, 3.5 foot tall kobold. Right? And I can take them and I can make a lot of them. Right, just by moving my mouse and hitting paste, and look at how they're all perfectly aligned on the grid here. Well, this gnome was loaded from D&D Beyond, so it's got all of its spells loaded. So I can go and hit the spells, and I hit that fireball again, and I can cast it. Well, that's not 20 feet. That's wrong, right? 20 feet, let's measure it. It should be 4 squares out. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, first of all, this is getting really ugly because I can see these hexes way too much. So the first step I'm going to do is I'm going to configure and I'm going to drop the opacity of the hexes. So I don't actually need those hexes. Right, and these hexes are here because of the measuring thing, right? But like this looks pretty, but the hexes do not. In fact, they're wrong, right? So if I center it on that, like a vertex is where you're supposed to center a fireball. And I count out 4 isometrics, and it still keeps going to 5. It's going more than 20 feet in the dimension, because this is measuring in the wrong perspective. There is no, these nice templates, I love this feature, but it doesn't work. So instead what we're going to do is I'm going to make a folder of spell templates here. I'm going to make a folder of spell templates, and I'm going to make them like actors that the PCs are going to have control over, so that my players are going to be able to go when they're playing the game, click on this folder and say, I'm casting fireball. I could go where? Go drop the template. So I'll have a bunch of the pre-size, 20-foot radius spells, but for the ones that get cast often, I can actually go do cool artwork. I can grab a fireball image or something and put it on top of a template. So here, I've got it perfectly aligned and gridded, so that, drop it here. Oh, sorry, I'm going to have some collateral damage and hit the barbarian. The player goes, I don't want to do that. Is there a way that I can move it? In fact, yes, you can. Because this is an actor, and because it's perfectly grid aligned, right, I can actually go and move it on this, so that here I can see it does not, this barbarian here didn't get hit. Now, this is different. This is not a 1 pixel, 1 hex big thing. If I go look at this actor, the fireball, and I go to the image, I see I am having it fill out a 12 grid by 12 grid size. So I'm going to have to resolve all the things with this actor. I can't have players edit a tile. They can only move and manipulate actors. So I'm going to have them drop it and then probably delete it. If it is something that I'm going to have stay on the page, like an area of effect that affects, I might have to draw it, or I might have to make a tile of it myself and kind of say, where do you want to do it? But if it's just an instant effect, I can have the players edit it, which is pretty cool, and then it goes away. So that is pretty cool. I take the big art, I scale it, and do that. Now let's talk through what I had to do and how I prefer to do larger sized creatures. Right. So I've sized all of these. So I've got a small creature, I've got a medium creature, I have a large enemy here. So its base takes up 2 isometric tiles by 2 isometric tiles, but I still have it on a 1 by 1 grid, and I'll explain why I do that. Here's a huge 3 by 3, and you can see that the art is allowed to stretch way past the pixels of the base, which I love. And here I got a gargantuan, right? So I've got an actual 4 by 4, which is larger than normal, but I think that scale looks cooler. for a gigantic Tyrannosaurus that I drew. So this is from Epic Isometric, all this art, and I drew this one myself, sort of trying to match as close as I could get at that Epic Isometric style. It's still on a 1x1 token, and I look at its image. I still have it on a 1x1 grid. I'm not increasing the size of it, and I used the hex token size support thing to adjust it so that the image wasn't tiny in here but was huge and aligned perfectly to the grid and snaps really nicely. Like, this thing moves perfectly. But you can see that it's still on a hex. Basically, I've got this nice little grabby piece that I can use to just grab it. But if I click here, nothing happens because that's just the overhang on the image. To grab the token, I'm going to have to grab it by this little front lip of its grid, and that's consistent across all these sizes. And what that means is I can now have, that classic example of, the warrior walks up and then, it has to teleports onto the back of the Tyrannosaurus and starts, having to make dexterity saving throws in order to stay on the back of the Tyrannosaurus. It's hanging up there. And then if I want to do and click the Tyrannosaurus and have it make an attack, I don't have to fight to click the thing underneath based on which token's on top. I just have to click it down over here. So imagine if I got, kobolds, and the kobolds are swarming over the Tyrannosaur. Let's go and copy, and then let's paste a whole bunch of kobolds, right? And they're all over the thing. That's fine. I can still click the Tyrannosaur because it's basically activation tile is right here. So I can click the Tyrannosaurus. I can go to its inventory. I can go to its bite. And I can go and roll, for the Tyrannosaurus on, in the roller down here, and it's going to work great. So, this is kind of my dream setup with spell tokens, with isometric, with all of that worked out. Limitations that I found, let's get into them. So, kind of getting back to our little PowerPoint here. I think I've covered everything. I have covered everything. Let's get into the limitations. So one of the limitations I found is that measuring problem that I talked about, where left to right, it's not going to count the distance for you correctly. So I'm taking this kobold and saying this kobold has, what speed does it have? It's probably here in the character sheet somewhere. It's probably speed of 30 feet of movement. Cool. This kobold, to rush up, I can hold the command key, and I can have it move up to 30 feet. That measure is perfect. It is exactly 6 tiles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hit the space bar to move it. However, the second that, and then it still works in the vertical dimension, up and down here, that works perfectly. It can go, that way, that way, that way, or that way, that way. That's all 6 hexes that are supported perfectly. But the second I want it to move left to right like this, it's not going to work. That when I want it to move left and right, or even a combination of movement, like say it wants to move here, that's not the most efficient way to get there. So the second that I start moving more left to rightish, I'm going to have to count these squares out myself. So I'm going to have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I got there in 25 feet of movement, not 35 feet of movement, which is what it automatically measured for me. So that's one problem. Here's another problem, and I'm a little hesitant to hit it because it does break some stuff. Sometimes in Roll20, what I would like to do is sort of emote with the actors by kind of shaking them around a little bit, and this snap happens. So all you have to do to move it and have it not follow the snap is drag and then hold the shift key when you put it down, and now I can put it wherever I want. I can move it to something that's off the snap. By hitting the shift key, it ignores snap just for that movement, but then it'll snap back. So I can still kind of emote and wiggle these minis a little bit with a more complex kit, so that's still useful. I like doing that for kind of animating. So I've got some, they'll rotate just fine, right? So I can kind of rotate them to, kind of indicate that they're moving or talking or something, right? And that'll work just fine. But the one thing that doesn't work that I do like doing in Roll20 is doing a horizontal flip. I've had problems, and I think you're going to run into them too. So if I mirror horizontally, yep, there it goes. So for some reason, that one just broke, and now this giant is the wrong size. I don't know if that's because the giant is taller than it is wide, so that it resets some of the stuff, whereas this Drider is wider than it is tall. Maybe that's the issue. I don't know. But, you know, now there isn't really a way to fix this, right? If I go and unmirror it, it doesn't snap back. I have to actually go redo that manually sizing. So when I play this, I'm gonna have to stay away from the horizontal flip. But aside from that, I mean, this is looking pretty good, right? So I can go to another scene, maybe the Thundering Lizard, a bar from the Tomb of Annihilation game, and I can activate it, right? And now I've got minis, and I've scaled in Photoshop. I made sure that bar was about the right height for this character. Maybe it's a little too tall still, I don't know. But I can have, you know, a big storm giant crash through the window, and everything is to scale, right? Everything's the way that I want it. I've got tactical movement when I want it, but if I just want this guy to jump up on the table, I don't really care that it aligns to the grid. I just drag it, hold the shift key, so you're on the side, you know, the edge of the table, regardless of whether that aligns to the map or not. It looks great. It looks perfect. I think I'm ready to play. I'm even ready to drop some fireballs, which is a favorite part of D&D. So thanks everybody for watching. You know, this is sort of my full isometric tutorial. I'm going to keep learning, but this is going to allow me to keep playing the way that I want to. Thank you to all the people that have kind of posted the portions of this. I didn't invent any of this. I just kind of put it together. And I'm really excited to see other people start using more isometric in Foundry. And if they don't want to play gridless, now they don't have to. They can actually play tactical, kind of mini, you know, snap to the grid type play, and start getting some of those advantages that we, you know, are jealous of the people who play top down. The one thing we don't get is that measurement tool. We have to use spell templates, but I'm willing to pay that price in order to play the way that I want to in the art style that I think is cool. All right, thanks everybody. So if you like this video and you want to keep following along, hey, subscribe, and I'd really appreciate your support. Thanks everybody.